Radio for readers, Bookmark.
This is Bookmark. I'm Marc Bernier. The nation's top authors are coming up next.
Bookmark.
Now, Ari Shavit. He is the author of the book, My Promised Land. Ari Shavit joins us for the Bookmark program from the Miami Book Fair. Ari, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
You were a paratrooper, am I correct?
I was.
In the Israeli army?
Yes, I was.
Tell us about that. When was that?
Well, I was. I'm proud of the fact that I was not a great paratrooper. What I did have is very high motivation. Partially, perhaps, because my brother was a pilot, and partially because I was committed to the country and I thought it was the right thing to do. In many ways, I think I'm more fit and more, perhaps even, I can be combative more now than I was. I was a paratrooper with a books of poetry in his rucksack, very lyrical paratrooper, but I did what I had to do because I thought that's needed in order to protect my country, and I'm very proud of the fact I did it.
I know that you do Israeli television, and you've worked in civil rights in Israel as well. Distinguished career. Still on the air, I take it?
Yes, my main role in Israel, I'm one of the leading columnists in the country. I write for Haaretz, which is the liberal paper, in the leading high-quality paper, and I do television weekly in Israel's Channel 1, so I'm a leading commentator there. So
Good.
Writing is my passion and my commitment, but as the world changed and media changed, I discovered television as well some years ago, and I do it, and I learned to enjoy it.
Okay, I've got to ask you a contemporary issue because all of our Jewish listeners are probably wondering what you're going to say about this. The current negotiations between this country and Iran over some sort of a settlement that would allow some sort of trade, humanitarian aid, has Israel very nervous because of this whole issue of appeasement. Many Americans, a growing number, are wondering if we are relegating ourselves to the Chamberlain effect of World War II, and I think Benjamin Netanyahu has actually spoken to this. Are we setting ourselves up for a big fall? Do you believe that?
I'm worried. I've been on top of the Iranian issue for a decade. And for years, it was very unpopular, unfashionable. People did not want to hear about it, both in Israel, in this country, and in other countries. So I think that what we see now is actually a reflection of a great failure of American, Israeli, and Western policy over a decade. So I think I urge everybody not to be... Iran is so big and so dangerous that I urge us not to get into partisanship and into personal debates. Definitely me, as an Israeli visiting this great country, it's not for me to say to Americans what should be their decision. This is your decision. But coming from that region, I would tell you, perhaps there is reason to listen to people coming from there. And I'll say just two things. One, if Iran would go nuclear, God forbid, not only Israel will be in jeopardy. Not only life in Tel Aviv will change, life in New York and Boston and Miami would change. Why? Because for 70 years, the greatest success of the West was to control the nuclear genie. We've taken that for granted. We are now, as it's Kennedy's 50th anniversary for his murder, and as we are in Miami, not so far from Cuba, let's remember that the Cuba crisis was President Kennedy, his approach, his brilliancy was not to go for extreme options, not to surrender and not to go to war, but to go for a third assertive option which saved the world, saved America. That's what's needed on Iran. That did not happen until now. And if, God forbid, Iran will go nuclear, that will change our civilization. So let's not make it an Israel issue. Let's not make it a Netanyahu issue. Let's not be venomous regarding President Obama. I'm sure he means the best. I think that if President Obama will follow his commitment and his assertive diplomatic approach of 2011 and 2012, we will be in a better place. If, God forbid, that approach will be abandoned, we have a risk of really having a nuclear Iran that will change life in America in this century.
Ari, do Israelis get fatigued and tired from always having to stand on their guard because you have the Iranian threat, you have certainly the Syrian threat, you have the Lebanese threat. Any one of those could act out, or they could work in unison and try to take out Israel. You're always, as a people, having to stand on guard. Doesn't that wear people down?
Great question. The subtitle of my book is The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. My Promised Land, the Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. And this is what it's all about, and this is why your question is so great. Because on the one hand, I'll begin with the tragedy. The tragedy is just what you said. The tragedy is that we face ongoing conflict for over 100 years. So we have the Palestinian issue and the Syrian threat and the Hezbollah and the Hamas. We live in a very rough and brutal neighborhood. And I urge all people who are critical of Israel to remember that this is the most endangered nation on the face of the earth. We, with all our faults, and I'm the first one to critical my government and our policies, but one always has to remember that the Jewish people that have been through the worst kind of history in the 20th century, that were the ultimate victims of Europe, still face existential threats that no other nation faces. But on the other hand, I think that what gives us the power to live there in such an incredible way is the triumph which I described. And this is exactly the other side of the same coin. Here you have a homeless people that had managed to build a home for itself. And the fact that these people that have been through the worst that people could go through in the 20th century did not whine, did not cry, did not go for suicide bombing, did not go for fanaticism, but when their greatest revenge was to live. And the fact that these ultimate refugees and survivors concentrated on giving education to their children, on building housing, on creating a society that is robust and lively and vital. Today, Israel is one of the most vital places in earth. It's creative, economically, technologically, science, art. So what you see is tragic circumstances, unclear future, but within that, an amazing spectacle of life. Israel is a feast of life. And this is what my book is about. It's, on the one hand, yes, look at the threats. They're incredible, and you have to be realistic about them. On the other hand, look at this exciting society that lives on the edge, in a sense, lives dangerously in the most remarkable way. I think, yet with all the criticism, that deserves admiration. And I urge people who do not see or lost sight of that big picture of what Israel is about to remember that. And my book celebrates that in the most colorful way possible.
Ari, I've wanted to ask you this question after reading some of your writings. I look at, from 1980 to the present, American presidents, Reagan, the two Bushes, to an extent President Ford, but let's take from 1980, Reagan, the two Bushes, and I look at how friendly and supportive they were to Israel, how they stood by Israel. And then I look at the wavering of President Obama, the wavering of President Clinton at times, and I think to myself, they were not as strong supporters of Israel's solemn state as the Republicans, yet in large numbers in the United States, Jewish Americans vote Democrat. What am I not seeing here? Why did they do that when it would appear that Republican leadership consistently stands lockstep with Israel? Why did they vote Democrat?
Well, again.
Am I wrong?
First of all, I apologize that I'll be cautious here, because really, I think it's my duty as an Israeli to have dialogue, candid dialogue with
Absolutely.
Americans. I do not want to intervene in your internal politics. I think it's wrong.
Okay.
But, and yet, I think one has to understand that the voting patterns of American Jews are based on their values. Jewish community in this country, although became very successful, kept the values of a minority that is in a sense, persecuted. The Jews have a very strong memory, and therefore, this is why their values are more the values of the Democratic Party. And
does it go back to Roosevelt?
I think it does. But I think that what is important, and this is my plea, that really to have Israel as a bipartisan issue, because the amazing thing that with all the controversies and all the problem, except for the extreme left, actually, Most Americans do have a deep feeling about Israel, which I think is remarkable. I think there is a kind of affinity of the great American democracy with this frontier democracy out there. I think that Americans see and understand what I'm talking about, the beauty of Israel and the dangers to Israel, sometimes better than Israelis see them. So I think that to keep Israel as a bipartisan issue that is not divided between Democrats and Republicans is an asset. I think it's definitely good for Israel. But by the way, I admire America. I admire America's role in the world. I think that America saved the world in the 20th century 5 times over. And I'm worried today about the relative weakness of America in the world. And I'm worried when I just came from Washington to see how America becomes bipartisan and sometimes your politics becomes dysfunctional. So I wish you will actually get over your internal divides. I want to see the strongest America possible. The world needs, it's only not only because I love America, the world needs a united, strong, reasonable, moral, but determined America. So I plea you, your viewers, your listeners, make America as great as it can be. It's in all our interests.
Alan Dershowitz appeared on this program in discussing his book, The Vanishing Jew. And he said that any attack on Israel is cataclysmic. And what he was referring to is, if we have a bomb that goes off in a shopping center and takes out 25 or 35 people, and forgive me, these may not be his exact words, that's tantamount to you losing a high skyscraper with thousands and thousands of people on a scale because of the size of Israel.
Absolutely.
Israel lives in this every day. Do you see more, from your vantage point, people being more vigilant in Israel now or more passive because they've been under siege and attack for so long?
Let me give you a concrete example. 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, it went on for 2 or 3 years, Israel experienced the worst terror offensive any democracy experienced. I mean, 9/11 was horrible, and I don't forget it for a moment. But really, what Israel experienced for over these 2 or 3 years, just to go with your numbers, is something that, you know, in numbers terms, is probably 100 times 9/11. And ongoing, not as just one event. For 2 or 3 years, our life were in many ways a nightmare. I lived in Jerusalem at the time. There was literally blood in the streets. Almost every other day, a suicide bomber would explode. I saw suicide bombers murdering people in shopping malls. I saw buses smashed. My own cafe in my own neighborhood cafe was blown to pieces. I will never forget the moment that I ran the 300 yards from my yard the moment I heard that puff, and I entered this cafe where I would sit every morning for a coffee and every evening for a light beer. And I entered my own cafe and I see these handsome boys and these gorgeous girls dead by the counter, by their beers. So the kind of brutality, the kind of evil that Israel experienced is horrific. And I think that it's in Israel's greatest achievement that we fended off that wave of terror. But I'll tell you what the victory was. It wasn't only our military, our IDF, which did a remarkable job, and our secret service that fended off this terror. But it's the Israeli society that, in face of that terrible challenge, proved to be resilient, strong, and yet sober. We did not go into extremism and not into defeatism. And I think that the fact that we won that war over terror shows how strong Israeli society deeply is. And yet, the challenges facing us today are even worse and more dramatic, especially the Iranian one, but some of the others. So we need all the power within us and all the power within you, because Iran, at the end of the day, is an American challenge and a Western challenge. We cannot deal with this on our own. So only if we have the spirit of great democracies working together, we'll fend off this terrible challenge that is endangering us all.
Finally, share with our listeners and viewers a little bit about the economy right now in Israel. There was high inflation several years ago. It calmed down a bit. Tell us, what impact is the ongoing terrorism attacks having on the economy as far as its tourism goes? It's still a very favorite place for Americans as well as other North Americans to go to visit. Has it had a great negative impact on the amount of Americans who wish to visit Israel?
It had in the past, but this is again, and if this is your last question, I'm happy to answer this on a really optimistic and happy note. Because what you saw is that under that terrible terror offensive only 10 years ago, the economy nearly collapsed. I mean, there was a point that really we were afraid what would happen to our banks, and the recession caused by terror was very, very dangerous. But after we won the war against terror, we did not only do that, but we revived our economy in an amazing way in two ways. One, our leadership had a very responsible, conservative fiscal policy, which enabled the economy to grow in a dramatic way. And two, all the Israeli skill and innovation erupted in this high-tech boom, which saved the country. And the result was that when the world went through this terrible crisis of 2008, all these years, before that, during the crisis and afterwards, Israel grew by nearly 5% average a year. The unemployment rate is one of the lowest in the world, and yet we have low inflation. So low inflation, low unemployment, high growth, an economic miracle that reflects the strength of the people of that country and the wise economic policies. It's a remarkable success story. Things are a bit slowing down now. There is something of a problem, and yet basically the tourists are back because they feel it's safe, and there are tourists from all over the world, all over the country. The country is booming. Israel, and if this is something I may say to your viewers and readers, Israel is a ball. Between wars, our life are the best there are. Come see it, look at it. It is a real man-made miracle. It's a celebration of life. It's all the time endangered. We must protect it. We must save it. We must know what's ahead and what is endangering it. But at the heart of all these dangers, in that brutal neighborhood, facing all these dark forces, Israel is a celebration of life.
Israeli commentator, television newscaster, and author Ari Shavit, the author of My Promised Land, our guest today on the Bookmark program. Ari, it's great seeing you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here.
That's Bookmark for this week. If you have comments or thoughts on future authors, send an email to us at our website, bookmark.us. That's our broadcast for today. Thanks for watching.